Stop waiting for everything outside to be resolved so you can finally feel okay. That's the mistake that's costing you everything you want. It's not a lack of effort. It's not a lack of faith. It's that you've learned, at the deepest neurological level, to outsource your peace. You learn to let circumstances dictate the state of your nervous system, and as long as you keep doing that, as long as you keep waiting for the external to change so the internal can quiet down, you will keep living the same reality on loop, because the physics of creation works exactly opposite to what you were taught. Neville Goddard knew this, and in recent years neuroscience has begun to confirm every word he wrote. What he called the assumed state is what science today calls coherence of the cardiac electromagnetic field. What he described as remaining unmoved in the face of facts is what neuroscientists define as autonomic regulation of the nervous system. The language changed. The principle is the same, and that principle is this: reality does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you are, to the state that your body and your emotional field emit consistently, moment after moment, day after day. In the next few minutes, you will understand exactly why remaining unmoved is not passivity. It is not indifference. It is the most advanced form of power that exists. And when you understand this at the biological level, when it stops being an intellectual idea and becomes a somatic experience, you will begin to observe something that many people call a miracle, but that is actually just the inevitable consequence of an aligned consciousness. Let's start at the beginning. The real beginning. Your nervous system has one main job. It's not to make you happy. It's not to help you attract what you want. Your nervous system's main job is to keep you alive. And to do this job efficiently, over millions of years of evolution, it developed an extraordinarily powerful reflex. React to the external environment. A loud noise. React. A perceived threat. React. A criticism, a rejection, a problem at work. React. This reflex was essential when the danger was a physical predator. The problem is that your nervous system does not distinguish between a lion on the savannah and a text message that made you feel insecure. To the body, a perceived threat is a real threat. And every time you automatically react to an external event, whether with anxiety, anger, fear, or despair, your nervous system is doing exactly what it was programmed to do. It's not weakness. It's ancestral biology operating in default mode. But here is the problem. And this problem changes everything. When your nervous system is in reactive mode, when you're constantly responding to what happens out there, your brain cannot access the creative state. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for vision, planning, perceiving opportunities, and the ability to make decisions aligned with your deepest desire. That cortex goes offline when the amygdala takes control. In simple terms, when you are in survival mode, you cannot be in creation mode. You cannot see the opportunities that exist around you. You cannot make the decisions that would change your trajectory. You cannot emit the electromagnetic field that would reorganize the circumstances around you. Because all your nervous system is doing is managing what is happening now, not what you want to create, what is happening now. And that is the cycle that keeps most people trapped. They react to the environment registers that reaction, and the environment keeps producing the same circumstances, because the field you emit when you are in reactive mode is a field of scarcity, urgency, lack, and the quantum field, like a perfectly faithful mirror, reflects back exactly what is being emitted. The way out of this cycle is not to act more. It is not to visualize with greater intensity. It is not to repeat affirmations more frequently. The way out is to change the state from which you act, visualize, and exist. The way out is to learn to inhabit a different internal state regardless of what is happening out there. That is what Neville called remaining unmoved. That is what neuroscience calls autonomic nervous system regulation. And that is what, when practiced consistently, begins to reorganize reality in ways that defy linear logic. True power was never in the circumstances. True power has always been in the state from which you observe them. Now let us understand the mechanism by which this internal state changes how reality responds to you. The human heart's electromagnetic field extends about 1 meter around the body in all directions. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable with scientific equipment. That field carries information, and the information it carries is determined by the predominant emotional state of the nervous system. When you are in coherence, when there is synchrony between heart rate, breathing, and emotional state, that field emits what researchers at the HeartMath Institute call a coherent signature, a signature of order, clarity, stability. When you are in incoherence, when your heart races from anxiety, when your breathing is shallow from worry, when your jaw is tight because you are expecting something to go wrong, that field emits a signature of chaos, urgency, defense. And here is what this means in practice. The people around you register that signature, not consciously, not with words. But the nervous system of every person you interact with perceives, in a fraction of a second, the field you are emitting. And it responds to that field, not to your words, to the field. That is why some people walk into a room and immediately create a sense of trust, lightness, authority, without saying a single word. And some people walk into the same room and immediately create a sense of tension, urgency, need for approval, even while smiling, even while saying the right things. The field speaks first, always. This means that when you remain unmoved in the face of a challenge, when you face a delay, a rejection, an uncertainty, without collapsing emotionally, you are not just managing your emotions, you are literally changing the field you emit into the world. You are breaking the response pattern that the people around you had of you. You are creating a new signature that the environment begins to recognize and mirror in different ways. Events do not define your experience. The interpretation you make of those events, the internal state from which you process them, is what determines whether they produce suffering or stability. Two people can go through the same event. One will collapse. The other will remain in balance and see an opportunity where the other saw a disaster. The difference is not in the event. It is in the internal state from which each processed it. And that state is something that can be deliberately chosen, deliberately trained, deliberately consolidated in the nervous system until it becomes the baseline, the automatic starting point from which you operate. That is why I prepared the prosperity magnet for you, because understanding this principle intellectually is not enough. Your nervous system has been conditioned for years to react, to go into survival mode, to interpret uncertainty as a threat, and you cannot think your way out of a deep emotional pattern. You need a tool that accesses the level where that pattern lives, the somatic level, the nervous system level, the brainwave level. The prosperity magnet is a 28-day journey designed to do exactly that. Reprogram the internal field, build the coherence that the environment begins to mirror, and install in your nervous system the state of someone who has already arrived, before the circumstances confirm that arrival. The details are in the first pinned comment. Comment coherent field. If you understand that reality responds to your state, not to your words. Now let's understand why miracles, and I use that word with scientific precision, are the natural consequence of a shift in assumption, not of effort. Neville Goddard spent decades teaching a concept that most people still haven't fully absorbed: the difference between wishing and assuming. Wishing operates from lack. When you wish for something, the emotional state implicit in that wish is the absence of what you want. I want more money means I don't have enough money right now. I want a relationship means I am alone right now. And when your nervous system processes these wishes, the field it emits is the field of absence, of lack, of waiting. And reality, which is a perfect mirror, keeps producing situations that confirm that absence. Assuming is different. Assuming means adopting at the level of the nervous system the emotional state of someone for whom the wish is already reality. Not pretending, not convincing the conscious mind of something it does not believe, but finding, in the structure of your nervous system, the state that would exist if the thing were already done, the feeling of coming home after a long trip, the relief of a problem that worried you deeply suddenly resolving, the lightness that exists when you are safe, when you are well, when there is no immediate threat. That state, that visceral, somatic, bodily feeling, is what Neville called the wish fulfilled. And he discovered, through decades of practice and observation, that when you inhabit that state with sufficient consistency, reality begins to reorganize itself to confirm that state. Neuroscience explains the mechanism. The ascending reticular activating system, the SRAA, is your brain's filter. It determines what you perceive and what you ignore from the environment around you, and it is calibrated by the predominant emotional state of the nervous system. When you are in a state of anxiety, the SRAA filters reality to show you evidence of threat, of problems, of risk. When you are in a state of certainty, peace and trust, the same filter begins to show you something different. Opportunities that were always there, but that you never noticed. Connections that are possible, but that never occurred to you. Paths that exist, but that a worried gaze could never see. This is what seems like a miracle, not because something impossible happened, but because the filter changed, and the reality that always existed begins to appear in a way it never appeared before. And here's the part that few understand. Anxiety, excessive control, the constant worry about when and how. These states don't just block the perception of opportunities. They actively interrupt the movements that reality is making to bring you what you want. Because when you're in control mode, you close doors you don't yet recognize as doors. You reject paths that don't look like what you imagined. You clench your fist at the very moment you should open it. Silent confidence, the state of someone who knows it's coming without needing to control how, is what keeps the doors open. It's what allows the invisible movements of reality to materialize at the right time, in the right way. The issue is not doing more. The issue is being different. And being different, at the level that matters, means continuously maintaining an emotional state that doesn't depend on external confirmation to exist. That brings us to the next principle, perhaps the most underestimated of all. Most people believe that the intensity of action is what produces results. Working more hours, sending more messages, making more calls, trying more times. And there are moments when action is absolutely necessary, but the quality of the action, the internal state from which it is executed, matters infinitely more than the quantity. 1 hour of action from a state of clarity, of certainty, of alignment, produces more results than 10 hours of action from a state of desperation, of urgency, of fear. That's because the field you emit while acting accompanies that action. When you send a message from a state of need for approval, the person who receives it perceives the emotional frequency beneath the words. When you give a presentation from a state of insecurity about the outcome, the audience feels it, even if you say the right words. And when you make a decision from a state of panic, you're not accessing your prefrontal cortex. You're making the decision with the part of the brain that was programmed to react, not to create. Emotional consistency, continuously maintaining a state of calm, inner certainty, stability, is not just a matter of personal well-being. It's a matter of creative efficiency. The nervous system that learns to inhabit a state of equilibrium by default perceives more, decides better, communicates more clearly, and emits a field that the environment recognizes as authority. And when the environment recognizes you as authority, not as someone who needs, but as someone who is, that it begins to respond in completely different ways. The people around you respond differently. The opportunities present themselves in ways that didn't happen before. The conversations reach conclusions that used to stagnate. Your presence begins to carry a different weight, not because you said something different, but because you are being something different. And that difference comes from the consistent repetition of the state, from the daily practice of returning to center when something tries to pull you away, from building a new neurological identity through emotional habit, not through words, but through the repeated sensation of who you decide to be. The Iman de Prosperidad was built specifically for this process. Each of the 28 days was designed to install, layer by layer, the state of someone who has already arrived. To build a new neurological identity that doesn't depend on external circumstances to exist. If you haven't yet gone to the first pinned comment, now is the time. Because what comes next requires an internal state that this process was created to develop. But before you go there, let's talk about the mechanism that most sabotages the results of those who have already understood all of this intellectually. Control. There is a fundamental distinction that needs to be understood here. The control born from fear is completely different from the clarity born from alignment. The control born from fear is what happens when you don't trust that the desire will arrive, so you try to force every detail of the how and the when. You repeatedly check the process. You alter the plan before it has a chance to work. You close off options before they develop. You act from the state of, what if it doesn't work, And that state is exactly what the quantum field registers and mirrors back. When Neville spoke of letting go, he wasn't talking about passivity. He wasn't saying to cross your arms and wait for life to deliver everything while you watch. He was describing a specific state, the state of one who trusted enough to open their hand, to stop holding so tightly that movement is prevented, to allow the greater intelligence of life, which includes paths you cannot see from your current vantage point, to find the most efficient route to where you want to arrive. Think of it this way. You don't drive the car looking at the hood. You look at the horizon. You trust that the car, the road, and your own motor system will manage the milliseconds of constant adjustment that keep the car moving forward. If you tried to consciously control every micro-adjustment of the steering, you would swerve. Trust in the process is what allows fluid movement, and that's exactly what happens when you release the need to control every detail of how reality should organize itself to give you what you want. Action still exists, but its nature changes. Action born from anxiety is circular, repetitive, draining. Action born from clarity is direct, efficient, energizing. When you are aligned, the actions that need to be taken become obvious. The right conversations arise, connections appear. The next steps reveal themselves, not through intense mental effort, but through the expanded perception of someone operating from a state of coherence. And this brings us to something that completely transforms the way you perceive your progress. The unshakable identity, the state of one who has learned to remain centered regardless of circumstances, doesn't just change what you do, it changes what you see, literally. The filter of your reticular activating system begins to perceive different evidence. What once seemed like a delay starts to be recognized as repositioning. What once seemed like a rejection starts to be perceived as redirection. What once seemed like silence starts to reveal invisible movement. There is a reason why people who have achieved extraordinary results often describe periods of apparent stagnation immediately before a significant turning point. Not because life paused, but because the deepest reorganization is rarely visible on the surface. Like bamboo, which spends years developing a vast, deep underground root system before appearing above ground and growing meters in weeks, reality is often doing the most important work behind the scenes, precisely when it seems like nothing is happening. The person who is in anxiety mode interprets this period of apparent silence as proof that it's not working. They change the plan, they intensify the effort, they enter control mode, and in doing so, they often interrupt exactly the process that was about to produce the result they were seeking. The person who has cultivated an unshakable identity perceives the same period of apparent silence from a completely different perspective. They recognize that the system is processing, that reorganization is happening on levels they cannot see directly. They maintain the state. They continue acting from clarity. And then, when the outcome appears, often through a path they could never have predicted, it does not feel like an accident. It feels inevitable. Because for their nervous system, for the field they were consistently emitting, it was inevitable. This is where Neville's miracles become understandable. They are not violations of the laws of physics. They are the natural consequence of a nervous system that has learned to consistently emit the field of one who has already arrived. Opportunities appear where there were none. People show up with exactly what is needed. Solutions present themselves through paths that no conscious planning could have identified. Not because life decided to make an exception for you, but because your field changed and the reality that was always available began to appear in ways the previous state never allowed you to perceive. And now is the moment when I need to be direct with you about one thing. You can keep watching videos about this. You can read more books. You can understand each concept with increasing depth and still remain stuck in the same pattern, because intellectual understanding does not reprogram the nervous system. The nervous system changes through repeated experience, through consistent exposure to a new state, through somatic practice, not mental comprehension. The Iman de Prosperidad was built to be that experience. 28 days of immersion in the process that reprograms the internal field, not with more content for the conscious mind, but with practices that access the autonomic nervous system, theta brainwaves, the cardiac electromagnetic field, to install at the level where real change happens, the state of one who has already arrived, the state that reality cannot ignore. Everything you need to know is in the first pinned comment. Before continuing, go there. What comes next is important, but it will only make complete sense to those who have already decided they are going to move from where they are. Because the closing of this cycle begins with a decision, and the decision begins now. Let's talk about what happens when this state stops being a practice and becomes an identity. When remaining unshakable stops being something you do and becomes something you are. There is a profound neurological difference between a person who practices calm and a person who is calm. The first still has reactivity as their baseline, as their automatic starting point, and uses techniques to return to center when they lose balance. The second has built a new baseline. Their autonomic nervous system has been literally recalibrated. The neural pathways of calm have become the path of least resistance, and that changes everything. When calm becomes identity, perception shifts permanently. You begin to notice patterns that were invisible before. Synchronicity, what Jung called meaningful coincidence, begins to appear with a frequency that cannot be ignored. The right person appears at the right time. The information you needed arrives from an unexpected source. A casual conversation opens a door you didn't know existed, not because the universe is giving you special treatment, but because your expanded perception, operating from a coherent field, has begun to recognize connections that the previous state automatically filtered out. The unshakable identity also changes how you process challenges. When an obstacle appears, and obstacles always appear, the automatic response of a recalibrated nervous system is not panic. It is not reactivity. It is a pause, an observation. A different question, not why is this happening to me, but what is this opening for me? This difference in framing is not merely semantic. It accesses completely different parts of the brain. It produces completely different responses. And those responses produce completely different results. Neville taught that so-called tests, the moments when reality seems to contradict what you are inwardly affirming, are actually opportunities for consolidation, not punishments, not proof that it isn't working, but moments when the identity you are building is tested in its depth. Every time you navigate one of these moments, without collapsing, without regressing to the old state, you strengthen the new identity at a deeper level. Every time you hold the state in the face of contrary evidence, you send a stronger, more coherent, clearer signature to the quantum field. And the field responds with more visible movements, with more obvious synchronicities, with results that begin to appear at a speed that once seemed impossible. And here is what many people have not yet realized. This process is not linear. Results do not appear in direct proportion to effort. They appear as a function of the coherence of the field, and that coherence has a tipping point. There is a moment when the accumulation of emotional consistency reaches a critical mass, and when that happens, the changes that seem to be happening in slow motion suddenly accelerate in a way that defies any linear explanation. This is what looks like a miracle. This is what Neville described as the inevitable consequence of remaining in the assumed state with sufficient consistency. But remaining in that state, especially when circumstances are still showing the opposite of what you want, requires a foundation that most people have never built. It requires a nervous system that has been deliberately recalibrated, an emotional identity that has been consciously installed, a new baseline that has been repeated enough to become automatic. That is why I arrive at the final point of what needs to be said. The reality you are living right now is the mirror of the internal state you have cultivated up to this point. Not as judgment, as law. The quantum field has no opinion about you. It does not punish, and it does not reward. It simply reflects, with perfect precision and without exception. What this means is that the reality you want, the relationships, the prosperity, the health, the peace, the feeling of being exactly where you should be, already exists as a possibility. It is already available for the field you need to emit in order to access it. The question is not whether it is possible. The question is which state you will inhabit tomorrow morning when you wake up. Because tomorrow morning, your nervous system will wake up and do what it has always done. It will seek the known pattern. It will pulse at the frequency it learned to pulse over years of repetition. Unless you decide, now, not after more reflection, not when circumstances are better, not when you feel more ready, that the state you will cultivate from today onward is different, that the identity you will install in your nervous system is that of someone who has arrived, that the signature you will emit to the field is one of peace, of certainty, of trust, not because circumstances have confirmed it, but because you have chosen it as your starting point. When peace becomes permanent, not as a momentary achievement but as a recalibrated baseline state, life begins to do something extraordinary. It stops presenting you with challenges that need to be controlled and starts presenting you with expansions that need to be embraced. The right people arrive, resources appear, paths reveal themselves, not because you did something extraordinary, but because you became someone whose internal field reality can no longer ignore. The miracles that Neville described over decades of teaching were not exceptions to the rule. They were the demonstration of the rule operating without interference. What he called elevated consciousness is what neuroscience today calls systemic coherence, the state in which the heart, brain, autonomic nervous system, and electromagnetic field operate in harmony, emitting a clear, consistent, and coherent signature to the environment. And when that coherence becomes the baseline, when it stops being a state you visit and becomes the place from which you operate, reality stops being something that happens to you and starts being something you create with consciousness, with clarity, and with a peace that surpasses all understanding. That is the destiny. That is the path, and that path begins with a decision now. You can close this video and tomorrow morning, your nervous system will wake up and repeat the same emotional past, the same patterns, the same frequencies, the same circumstances, with different names, different faces, but the same energetic signature underneath. Or you can act now. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel more ready. Now. Because the quantum field does not respond to future intentions. It responds to the present state. And the present state is exactly this moment, the decision you are making now. The details of the Iman da Prosperidad are in the first pinned comment. 28 days. A new baseline, a new identity, a new signature that the field cannot ignore. And before you go there, comment "I am unperturbable" down below, not as an empty gesture, as an identity command, as the first instruction you are giving to your nervous system that the state you choose from now on is different. Biology is waiting for your instruction. Reality is waiting for your signature. Decide now.